In the fall of 2011, Austin, Texas was a city straddling two worlds, modern skyscrapers and booming tech startups on one side, quiet tree-lined streets and old money estates on the other. It was in this city, just a few miles from the Colorado River's bend, that Jason Whitmore lived a life most could only imagine. Jason was 44 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the calm authority of someone who'd been making big decisions for a long time. He was the CEO of Whitmore Foods, a national frozen food company his grandfather had founded in the 1950s. For decades, their logo had been a fixture in grocery store freezer aisles, the brand trusted in kitchens from Maine to California. By the time Jason took over, the company was already worth hundreds of millions. Under his leadership, it was expanding into ready-to-eat gourmet meals, and industry magazines were calling him one of the food visionaries of the decade. To the public, Jason was the golden boy of a proud Texas business dynasty. But away from the cameras and the glossy business profiles, his personal life was complicated. His first marriage had ended quietly with no public scandal, just the slow unraveling that sometimes happens when ambition outpaces intimacy. Since then, he'd been single in name but rarely alone. Women noticed him, but not always for who he was. He knew it. He'd grown accustomed to the unspoken truth. His fortune drew people in before his personality ever had the chance to. Jason had a taste for the finer things. He collected rare wines, some bottles worth as much as a car. He kept a locked room full of hunting rifles, meticulously maintained and displayed. He traveled for both business and pleasure, one week in Napa sampling vintages with other collectors, the next in Montana tracking elk through the snow. But no matter where he went, one habit persisted. He liked the company of women. And not just any women. He was drawn to those who projected beauty and confidence, the kind who could turn a dinner into an event. It was through a high-end dating service, one that blurred the lines between matchmaking and paid companionship, that Jason first met Samantha Reed. Samantha was 31 then. She'd grown up in Pine Hollow, a small, working-class town in Arkansas, far from the polished skyline of Austin. Her childhood wasn't the kind you'd wish on anyone. Her father left before she could walk. Her stepfather, who came later, had a temper and a taste for whiskey, and his anger often found its target in her and her mother. By the time she was in her teens, she had learned to survive by anticipating moods, reading body language like road signs, and keeping her own emotions hidden. At 17, she left home, putting herself through community college and later nursing school. Nursing was supposed to be her escape, a stable career, a way to help people, a way to prove she could rise above the chaos she'd been born into. And for a while it was. She wore her scrubs with quiet pride, worked night shifts at a local hospital, and told herself she could build a life from there. But the reality was harsher. In the hospital, she was surrounded by loss. Patients who didn't make it. Families crying in waiting rooms. After a few years, the grief began to stick to her, as if each death took something she couldn't get back. She slid into depression, and eventually, she knew she couldn't keep doing it. She left nursing, thinking she'd try for law school instead, but tuition bills stacked up faster than she could pay them. That was when a friend mentioned the dating service. It wasn't advertised as escort work, but everyone involved understood the arrangement. Wealthy clients paid for companionship, sometimes dinner, sometimes more. For Samantha, it was a way to keep a roof over her head while finishing her classes. It was supposed to be temporary. Jason's first meeting with Samantha wasn't fireworks, it was curiosity. She didn't lean in too quickly or bat her eyelashes on cue. She asked him questions about his work, about the challenges of running a family business, about the wine regions he'd visited. She didn't pretend to be impressed by his gun collection, but she listened closely when he explained why hunting wasn't just about the kill for him. It was about patience, preparation, respect for the environment. And she surprised him by saying she'd grown up around rifles, that she knew how to shoot, and that she'd be interested in joining him on a trip sometime. For Jason, that was unusual. Most women in his world smiled politely at the talk of hunting, then changed the subject. Samantha leaned into it. And that, he would later tell a friend, was when I knew she was different. Their arrangement shifted quickly. Within a few months, Jason wasn't seeing anyone else from the service. He began inviting Samantha to events, though always introducing her as a friend. He paid her rent, covered her tuition, and eventually suggested she move in with him. The relationship was still a secret from his family and many of his closest friends. Those who did meet her weren't shy about voicing their doubts. Why would a young, attractive woman with no visible source of income be so devoted to a man over a decade older? The word gold digger floated in the air at dinner parties, sometimes said outright, sometimes just implied with a knowing glance. Jason ignored it, or pretended to. He had divorced his first wife without hesitation, and he was ready to start over with Samantha. Within a year, they were married. The wedding was small, Jason's choice. He claimed it was about privacy, but the truth was he didn't want to give certain people the chance to voice their objections in the middle of his vows. After the ceremony, Samantha moved into his sprawling high-rise penthouse overlooking Lady Bird Lake. It was a world away from the life she'd known in Arkansas. Inside, there was a glass-walled wine cellar worth nearly $3 million, a gun room holding over $500,000 in rare rifles and shotguns, modern art on every wall, and, because Jason liked to surprise people, a massive Burmese python in a custom glass enclosure in the den. Samantha didn't flinch at the snake. Jason loved telling people that part. She's the only woman I've ever been with who doesn't mind sharing the house with a python. At first, it seemed they were proving everyone wrong. The marriage was affectionate, adventurous. They traveled, hosted friends, and shared hobbies in a way that made Jason think he'd finally found a true partner. In photographs from those years, they're smiling on ski slopes, standing on the deck of a yacht in the Caribbean, or posing beside a trophy elk in the Rockies. Looking back, it's easy to say that beneath those pictures, fault lines were already forming. But in those early years, no one could see them. The story of Jason and Samantha wasn't just about a man and a woman falling in love. It was about two people from opposite ends of the American experience, old money and no money, meeting in the middle and trying to stay there. They would for a time. But the cracks were coming. And when they finally split open, the whole country would be talking about it. By the time Samantha Reed stepped into Jason Whitmore's life, she had already lived more than one lifetime's worth of hardship. Pine Hollow, Arkansas wasn't a place people dreamed about moving to. It was a place they left if they could. A town of low-slung houses, a shuttered factory, and a single main street lined with a gas station, a diner, and a handful of thrift stores. The economy there was survival, not ambition. People worked 2 jobs and still counted the days to payday. Samantha's earliest memories were of silence, not the peaceful kind, but the tense quiet that came before something bad happened. Her father had left when she was still in diapers, disappearing so completely that she had no photographs of him past her 2nd birthday. Her mother remarried when Samantha was 5. The man she brought into their lives was a drinker, and when the bottle emptied, his temper filled the space. Home was never a refuge. Samantha learned quickly to read the sound of boots on the porch, the pace of footsteps, the slur in a voice. She became an expert in vanishing into the background when trouble was brewing. And trouble came often. By her early teens, she had been through episodes that would leave scars she didn't talk about. Physical confrontations, nights locked outside in the cold, even a terrifying 2 days when she was taken by a local man she barely knew and released without explanation. In a place like Pine Hollow, no one called the police for things like that. People whispered, shook their heads, and moved on. At 17, Samantha did what so many in her situation only dreamed of. She left. A duffel bag of clothes, a bus ticket, and just enough determination to keep moving forward. She stayed with a friend in Little Rock, worked odd jobs, and finished high school through night classes. It wasn't just ambition that drove her. It was the idea that she could build a life where no one could control her again. Nursing school seemed like the perfect choice. Stable, respected, and rooted in the idea of helping others. She pushed through community college, then a 2-year nursing program, earning her license. For a few years, it worked. She wore scrubs, carried a stethoscope, and clocked into the ER of a mid-sized hospital. The work was demanding but meaningful, at least at first. But there's a weight to seeing death up close, and in there, it never stopped. Children who didn't make it. Patients whose families screamed in grief. Samantha would go home and still hear the monitors beeping in her head. The depression came quietly. Sleepless nights. The feeling that each shift stripped away a little more of her ability to care. When she found herself crying in the staff bathroom after pronouncing a patient dead, she knew she was finished. She thought about law school, an entirely new direction. She liked the idea of building cases, of fighting for people. But tuition costs were a mountain she couldn't climb on a nurse's salary. She worked part-time jobs, but the math didn't add up. That was when a friend, half joking, told her about a dating service in Dallas that catered to wealthy clients. It wasn't advertised as escort work, but it didn't take long for Samantha to understand the arrangement. The money was good, astonishing compared to what she'd been making. She told herself it was temporary, just until she had enough saved to pay for classes. She thought she could keep her heart separate from the work. Then Jason walked in. He was different from her other clients. He didn't rush the evening or try to impress her with flashy gifts right away. He asked questions, listened. He was precise in the way he spoke, almost surgical, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on things like the best cuts of wild game or the logistics of managing a hospital ward. She told herself she was still working, but part of her liked the way he looked at her, as if she wasn't just another pretty face in his orbit. When Jason began inviting her to events, dinners, charity galas, she played the part flawlessly. A cream silk dress for one night, a tailored black sheath for another. She knew how to adapt, how to blend into a world she'd never been part of. Jason covered her rent, then her tuition. Within months, she'd stopped taking other clients. Moving into his penthouse was like crossing into another country. Samantha had never lived anywhere with a doorman, never stood in a kitchen where the appliances cost more than her childhood home. But she adjusted quickly. She learned the vintages in Jason's wine cellar, how to load and clean the rifles in his gun room, and even how to navigate the strange social dance of his business gatherings. Outwardly, the marriage that followed looked solid. They traveled, laughed, entertained. Jason seemed proud to have her at his side. For a while, Samantha believed they'd beaten the odds. But there were cracks, hairline fractures that would grow deeper over time. Jason could be charming in public, but behind closed doors, he had rules. Little ones at first, preferences about her clothing, the way she greeted his colleagues, what she posted on social media. Over time, they became controls. He didn't like her having male friends. He wanted to know where she was at all times, sometimes calling every half hour when she was out without him. Samantha tolerated it at first. She told herself it was jealousy, maybe even a kind of devotion. But somewhere deep down, she knew it was about power. In 2015, they began trying for a child. When it didn't happen naturally, they turned to IVF. The process was grueling. Hormone shots, endless appointments, and the emotional roller coaster of failed cycles. After more than a year, they succeeded. The birth of their daughter seemed to soften Jason. For a while, the tension eased. Samantha thought they'd made it through the hardest part. She thought she could forget the controlling moments, the subtle put-downs, the way he sometimes called her crazy when they disagreed. But old habits have a way of returning. And Jason's, well, his habits could be dangerous to a marriage. By the spring of 2020, she would see just how dangerous. By the spring of 2020, Austin was heating up again. The air had that restless quality Texans knew meant summer was coming. Life in the Whitmore penthouse, however, had cooled. Jason was busier than ever. Whitmore Foods was in the final stages of negotiating a massive acquisition deal. Numbers floated in the hundreds of millions. It was the kind of transaction that would not only cement his legacy in the industry but also secure generational wealth for his family. The meetings were long, the travel frequent, and Jason seemed even more unavailable than usual. Samantha, meanwhile, was splitting her time between motherhood and keeping herself in the kind of shape Jason liked her to be in, both physically and socially. She hosted small gatherings for Jason's business partners' wives, took their daughter to the park, and made appearances at charity events. From the outside, she was still the picture-perfect wife, graceful, well-spoken, the kind of woman people photographed for society pages. But inside, her instincts were stirring. Something in Jason's routine was off. He'd always been protective of his phone, but now it seemed welded to his hand. He'd step into another room to take calls. He'd mention meetings in vague terms, and when pressed, would shrug them off. Samantha had learned long ago to pay attention to the little inconsistencies. She didn't explode at the first suspicion. She observed. She waited. That's when Emily Carter, her closest friend in Austin, brought it up. They were sitting at a coffee shop downtown, their daughters playing in the small enclosed area meant for children. Emily lowered her voice. "I don't want to upset you, Sam, but I saw Jason last week." Samantha looked up from her lot. "Where?" "Riverside Grill." He wasn't alone. He was with, well, she looked a lot younger. And the way they were sitting, Emily hesitated. It didn't look like business. Samantha didn't argue. She didn't get defensive. She simply nodded, filed the information away, and decided to get answers. She hired a private investigator the next day. Not a corporate firm, someone discreet, recommended by a lawyer she trusted. A man named Frank Delaney. He was older, grizzled, with a voice like gravel and a way of looking at you that made lying seem pointless. "You sure you want to know?" he asked when she explained the situation. "Yes," Samantha said, "but I want proof. Not rumors." Frank didn't waste time. Within days, he had photographs. Jason, in a blue blazer and open-collar shirt, seated across from a woman at a wine bar. Jason and the same woman leaving the Driscoll Hotel just after midnight. Jason holding her hand briefly before getting into his car. Her name, Frank told her, was Natalie Moore. 26 years old. A part-time model. And, according to his digging, an escort, booked through the same elite service that had once connected Samantha to Jason. The sting of betrayal wasn't just in the affair. It was in the symmetry of it. Jason was retracing the same path he'd taken with her, down to the settings and the gestures. The same restaurants. The same wine bar. Even the same kind of dress, black satin, thin straps. It wasn't just infidelity. It was as if he was erasing their history and replacing her with someone else. When Samantha confronted Jason with the photos, she expected, at the very least, denial, a fight, maybe even a performance of remorse. What she got was indifference. He looked at the photos without flinching. "You hired someone to follow me? You've been lying to me." "I've been living my life," he said flatly. "If that bothers you, maybe you should think about why." The conversation spiraled. Samantha accused. Jason deflected. He didn't promise to stop seeing Natalie. He didn't even pretend. That night, he slept in the guest room. Over the next week, the distance grew. Jason came home later and later. Sometimes he wouldn't come home at all, claiming he'd stayed at the office. Samantha's calls would go unanswered for hours. Then, in early May, Samantha decided to visit her mother in Pine Hollow, taking their daughter with her. It was partly to get space, partly to see if Jason would notice her absence. While she was gone, Frank kept watching. His updates were consistent. Jason met Natalie almost every day. They had dinner. They checked into hotels. Sometimes they were seen at the same spots Jason used to take Samantha when they were first together. Frank's final report, complete with time-stamped photos, read like a love story, just not hers anymore. By the time Samantha returned to Austin, she wasn't just hurt. She was humiliated. In her mind, Jason hadn't just cheated, he'd done it publicly, almost daring people to notice. And in their circles, people did notice. She began to imagine the whispers behind her back, the looks at events, the pity disguised as sympathy. It's one thing to be betrayed. It's another to be made a spectacle. The day she came back, Jason picked her and their daughter up at the airport. The security footage in the building lobby would later show the three of them walking toward the elevator together. No one watching could have guessed what was simmering beneath the surface. That evening, Jason ordered pizza for dinner. Samantha remembered him stepping away to take a call, his voice low. When he came back, he said it had been his father and that he needed to stop by his parents' house later. But Samantha already knew that wasn't true. She'd seen the patterns. She could almost script his movements now. And somewhere in the hours that followed, her anger began to harden into something else. By late May 2020, the Whitmore marriage wasn't just strained, it was fraying at every seam. Samantha had the evidence she'd asked for. Jason knew she had it. And still, He didn't stop seeing Natalie more. It became a silent war in their penthouse. Conversations were clipped. Meals were eaten at different times. Even their daughter, too young to understand, sensed something in the air, the way her parents' voices stayed cool in front of her but tightened when she left the room. Samantha had grown up in conflict. She knew how it worked. Small disputes would pile up, each one like a match tossed into dry grass. Eventually, something would ignite. The question was only when. In the first week of June, Jason's schedule was packed with acquisition meetings. At least, that was what he told her. Samantha had stopped asking questions, partly because she already knew the answers, partly because she was trying to decide her next move. Frank Delaney's photos were tucked in the back of her closet, inside a box where Jason would never look. She'd considered taking them straight to a divorce attorney, but that meant opening a different battle, one she wasn't sure she could win. Jason had money, influence, and the kind of reputation that could sway people before they heard a word from her. And there was their daughter. The thought of losing her was a knife Samantha couldn't bear to turn in her mind for long. On the afternoon of June 12th, Samantha took their daughter to a friend's house for a playdate, then returned home to find Jason in the living room. He was standing near the window, phone in hand, speaking in that low, guarded tone she now recognized instantly. When he noticed her, he ended the call abruptly. "Business," he said. It wasn't an answer, it was a dismissal. That evening, they didn't cook. Jason suggested ordering pizza. The delivery came just after 8. Building security footage would later show him taking the elevator down alone to meet the delivery driver, then returning to the penthouse with the box balanced in one hand. They ate in the living room, the TV on but unwatched. Conversation was minimal. Afterward, Jason mentioned again that his father had called, asking him to stop by later. Samantha just looked at him. "You're not going to your father's," she said flatly. Jason paused, a flicker of something, irritation, in his eyes. "I am. Why would I lie about that?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Jason set down his plate and leaned back in his chair. "You've been acting paranoid for months, Sam. This isn't healthy." "Paranoid," she repeated, her voice sharper now. "I've got pictures, Jason. You and her. Everywhere we used to go." His expression didn't change. "You hired a PI because you couldn't handle your own insecurities. That's on you." The exchange escalated quickly. Samantha accused him of humiliating her in public, of replacing her with someone younger. Jason countered with insults, that she was unstable, that no man would want her if they divorced, that the only thing keeping her in this life was his generosity. And then, for the first time in nearly a decade of marriage, Jason hit her. It wasn't hard enough to knock her down, but the shock was worse than the pain. There are moments in some marriages when the balance tips for good, when the possibility of repair slips out of reach. For Samantha, that moment had arrived. She stood there, her cheeks stinging, the room spinning slightly. Jason kept talking, his words sharp and deliberate. "If you think you're taking our daughter, you're out of your mind," he said. "You'd be in a psych ward before that happened." She didn't remember deciding to do it. She remembered moving, across the room, into the gun room Jason had once shown her with pride. She knew exactly where the keys were kept. She had handled every firearm in that collection on hunting trips. The pistol was lighter than she expected in that moment. Or maybe her hands were just numb. Jason was still in the hallway when she stepped out. They were 6 feet apart. The version Samantha would later give police was that she raised the gun and fired in the heat of the moment, a single shot to stop him from coming at her again. But forensic evidence would later contradict her. The bullet entered from above, exiting through his chin, a downward trajectory that suggested he was sitting or even kneeling when the trigger was pulled. Whatever the exact position, Jason went down instantly. The sound in the enclosed space was deafening. For a moment, all Samantha could hear was the ringing in her ears. Then came the silence. She stood over him, the gun still in her hand, her pulse hammering. It was over, but not in the way that meant life could go on. She knew in that instant that the life she'd built was gone. Prison was the future. Her daughter would grow up without her, unless she could make the body disappear. The thought was horrifying, but it landed with cold clarity. She'd been on enough hunting trips to know what was required to break down a body. Jason himself had taught her, skinning deer and cleaning game with precision. She didn't remember every step clearly later, trauma she would say, but she remembered enough. The sound of the hunting knife sliding from its sheath, the cold tile under her knees, the mechanical focus it took to keep going. Hours later, Jason's remains were in 3 large suitcases, lined with garbage bags. She wiped down every surface she thought might hold evidence. At dawn, she loaded the suitcases onto a luggage cart and wheeled them toward the service elevator. The building's security cameras caught her struggling with the weight, pausing to catch her breath. By mid-morning, the suitcases were gone from the building. Where they went and how they were found would become the next chapter in the story, one that would make national headlines and split public opinion down the middle. But on that night, as Samantha rode the elevator back up to the penthouse, she was just one person in an expensive dress, stepping into a home that no longer belonged to anyone. The first suitcase was found on June 19th, a full week after Jason Whitmore had last been seen alive. That morning, a county maintenance worker was clearing roadside brush on a quiet 2-lane road outside Westlake Hills, just northwest of Austin. He noticed a large, dark gray hardshell suitcase sitting half-hidden under a tangle of cedar branches. It looked out of place, too heavy for anyone to have left by accident. When he tried to move it, the handle bent slightly under the strain. The zipper was shut, but there was a faint, sour odor coming from the seam. The worker called the Travis County Sheriff's Office. By the time deputies arrived, the smell was unmistakable. They cut the lock and unzipped the case. Inside, wrapped in heavy-duty plastic, was a human torso. Less than 2 hours later, a second suitcase was found by a hiker in an open field near Bee Cave, about 7 miles away. It contained dismembered limbs. And later that same afternoon, a third suitcase was discovered in a wooded area closer to Lake Travis. This one held the victim's head, still wrapped but identifiable by distinctive dental work. The medical examiner's office confirmed what investigators already suspected. The remains belonged to 44-year-old Jason Whitmore. The cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the head, the bullet entering from above and exiting through the chin. The precision of the dismemberment struck investigators immediately. Whoever had done it knew anatomy, not just where to cut, but how to work around joints cleanly. The coroner noted the kind of skill seen in hunters, but also in people with medical training. With the location of the finds plotted on a map, detectives began looking at who in Jason's life could have had the time, knowledge, and emotional motive to carry this out. They didn't have to look far. Back at the Whitmore penthouse, investigators reviewed building security footage from the week Jason disappeared. On June 12th, cameras recorded Jason returning from the lobby with a pizza delivery at 8:13 p.m. He was never seen leaving again. The next morning at 6:42 a.m., the cameras showed Samantha Reed wheeling a luggage cart stacked with 3 large suitcases down the service corridor. She paused several times, bracing her back and shifting her grip. She entered the service elevator alone. The elevator returned empty minutes later. No one else had moved luggage of that size out of the building in that time frame. When detectives questioned Samantha that same day, she stuck to her original story. Jason had left the night before to visit his father and never returned. When pressed about the suitcases, she claimed they contained seasonal clothing she'd taken to a storage unit. But when asked which storage unit, she hesitated. The officers noted it. Detectives obtained a search warrant for the penthouse. Inside, they found traces of blood in the hallway and in the gun room, faint but visible under luminol. They also found cleaning supplies still damp in a trash bin. The gun that matched the fatal bullet was missing. By now, Samantha's calm demeanor in interviews was starting to look less like composure and more like calculation. 2 days after the discovery of the suitcases, she was brought in for a formal interrogation. At first, she denied any involvement. She suggested Jason might have been targeted because of his company's pending acquisition deal. She floated the idea of a kidnapping gone wrong. But the evidence was stacking higher than her denials. The footage, the blood traces, the forensic match between the cut patterns on the remains and the hunting knives known to be in Jason's gun room. And then there was the private investigator. When detectives learned Samantha had hired Frank Delaney weeks earlier to follow Jason, they brought him in for questioning. Frank's testimony sealed a critical piece. Samantha had confronted Jason about the affair days before his disappearance. And Jason had not reacted with apology, only indifference and hostility. This gave prosecutors something they could use in court. Motive. On June 24th, Samantha was arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. She was booked into the Travis County Jail without bond. The news broke within hours. Local TV stations ran split-screen images. Jason in his business suit, Samantha in evening gowns at charity events. The contrast between the glamorous public couple and the grisly reality was irresistible to headlines. Public opinion split fast. Some saw Samantha as a cold-blooded killer who couldn't stand to lose her wealthy lifestyle. Others believed her claim, whispered through her first lawyer, that she'd acted in self-defense after years of emotional abuse and control. But one fact was hard to argue with. Dismemberment takes time. It takes planning, tools, and a mental state far from panic. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together the final hours before Jason's death. They believed the argument over dinner had escalated to violence, that Samantha had retrieved the gun from the locked cabinet Jason himself had taught her to use, and that she'd fired while he was sitting, catching him completely off guard. From there, the cleanup was meticulous. Too meticulous for someone acting purely in blind rage, prosecutors would later argue. The trial was months away, but already the lines were being drawn. The state would paint her as a manipulator who married for money and killed to avoid losing it. The defense would frame her as a survivor of abuse pushed beyond her limits. And the truth, if such a thing could be found, was somewhere between the glossy photographs of their life together and the 3 suitcases left in the Texas hills. The Travis County Courthouse was no stranger to high-profile cases, but in the fall of 2021, the name Samantha Reed turned it into a circus. For months, the tabloids and local news had been dripping out every detail they could find. Court filings, leaked text messages, surveillance stills. Talk radio hosts debated whether she was a calculating gold digger or a woman pushed to her breaking point. Social media swelled with hashtags, some calling for her conviction, others framing her as a victim of Jason Whitmore's wealth and influence. On October 4th, jury selection began. Prosecutors knew the challenge. Almost everyone in Travis County had heard of the case. Finding 12 impartial people would be difficult. In the end, the panel they chose was a mix, 7 women, 5 men, ranging from their 20s to their 60s. The prosecution's opening statement was direct and unflinching. This case, Assistant District Attorney Michelle Navarro told the jury, is about control and greed. The defendant married into wealth, enjoyed its benefits for years, and when she felt it slipping away, she killed to keep it. Navarro walked them through the timeline, the affair, the private investigator's photographs, the confrontation. Then came the forensics, the bullet's downward trajectory, the knife work on Jason's remains, the suitcases wheeled out in the early morning hours. She showed a still frame from the building's security camera, Samantha straining to maneuver the luggage cart toward the service elevator. "Ladies and gentlemen," Navarro said, "that is not the act of a woman defending herself from immediate harm. That is the act of a woman covering up a cold-blooded killing." The defense, led by attorney Robert Kellerman, took a different tack. He didn't deny that Samantha had fired the shot. Instead, he reframed the narrative. This was a case of long-term psychological abuse culminating in a moment of deadly self-preservation. He described Jason not as the charming CEO seen in magazines, but as a controlling husband who monitored Samantha's whereabouts, dictated her friendships, and chipped away at her self-worth. He told the jury about the slur-laced arguments, the threats to take their daughter, the humiliation of his public affair. When Samantha pulled that trigger, Kellerman said, she believed her safety and her future with her child were in immediate danger. Was it tragic? But was it murder? It was survival. From the start, the trial was as much about perception as evidence. The prosecution's case. Over the first 2 weeks, prosecutors called forensic experts who testified that the gunshot could not have happened as Samantha claimed. The entry wound's angle indicated Jason was sitting or crouching, not standing or advancing toward her. The state's crime scene reconstruction placed him on the couch, likely relaxed or distracted, when he was shot. The medical examiner detailed the dismemberment, noting that it required not only anatomical knowledge but also a calm, methodical approach. This was not done in panic, she told the jury. This was done with deliberation. The state also called Frank Delaney, the private investigator. He confirmed under oath that Samantha had confronted Jason with proof of his affair days before his death. She wasn't hysterical, he testified. She was angry, yes, but controlled. She told me she wanted to know the truth so she could decide her next step. Finally, they brought in Jason's colleagues and friends, some of whom hinted that Samantha had enjoyed the perks of marriage but rarely showed interest in Jason's business unless it involved spending or appearances. One former friend of Jason's said bluntly, she knew exactly what she married into. And she knew exactly what she stood to lose. The defense's case. When it was their turn, the defense called Samantha herself to the stand. It was a calculated risk. Dressed in a modest navy dress, her hair pulled back, she spoke softly as she recounted her childhood in Pine Hollow, the abuse, the poverty, the years of clawing her way into a different life. She described meeting Jason, their early connection, and the way things changed after the wedding. He wanted to know where I was every minute, she said, her voice catching. If I didn't answer his calls, there would be a fight. He told me more than once that I was crazy, that no one else would ever want me. And when I found out about Natalie, it wasn't just betrayal. It was like he was erasing me. When Kellerman asked about the night of June 12th, Samantha said Jason had been drinking and became verbally aggressive after dinner. He told me I'd never see our daughter again, that he'd have me locked up. Then he slapped me. She claimed she went to the gun room to put space between them, but when Jason followed, she believed he was going to hurt her worse. I remember pulling the trigger and then, nothing. Just ringing in my ears. Under cross-examination, Navarro pressed her on the inconsistencies. Why was the shot fired at a downward angle? Why did she have the presence of mind to clean, dismember, and dispose of the body? Why didn't she call 911 if it was truly self-defense? Samantha's answers grew shakier. I was in shock, she repeated. I wasn't thinking straight. Public reaction. Outside the courthouse, the divide was visible. Some days, women's advocacy groups showed up with signs reading "Believe survivors." On others, local business owners brought placards calling her the suitcase killer. The media played both sides. Morning shows debated whether her past as a high-end escort was relevant to her motive. True crime podcasts dissected the suitcase footage frame by frame. Closing arguments. Prosecutor Navarro stood before the jury one last time. The defendant wants you to believe she acted in the heat of the moment. But heat of the moment doesn't come with 3 separate disposal sites. It doesn't come with bleach and garbage bags and cutting around joints to fit a body into luggage. That is planning. That is intent. Kellerman's final words were aimed not at sympathy but at doubt. You've heard from experts, from friends, from Samantha herself. But at the end of the day, only 2 people were in that penthouse on June 12th. One is gone. The other is here telling you she feared for her life. If you can't say beyond a reasonable doubt that this was murder, you must find her not guilty of that charge. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the afternoon of the 3rd, they filed back in. The foreman read the verdict, guilty of second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. Samantha Reed was sentenced to 22 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18. Custody of her daughter was awarded to Jason's parents. As she was led away, Samantha didn't cry. She glanced briefly at the gallery, at Emily Carter, at Frank Delaney, at the reporters scribbling in their notepads, and then disappeared through the side door. The case was over in the courtroom. But in Austin's coffee shops, bars, and dinner tables, the argument was just beginning. Was justice served? Or had the jury punished a woman as much for her past as for her crime? The courtroom emptied slowly after the verdict. The jurors filed out, their faces set in the tight expressions of people who had just carried a heavy burden. The gallery broke into quiet clusters. Jason's family embracing each other, Samantha's few supporters sitting frozen in disbelief, reporters dictating hurried notes into their phones. Samantha was led through the side door, shackles at her wrists and ankles. There was no display of emotion. No tears, no outburst. Just the quiet composure she had maintained for most of the trial, as if she had learned long ago that giving people a reaction was like giving them a weapon. Life behind the gates. She was processed into the Gatesville Correctional Facility, a sprawling complex 2 hours north of Austin. The press didn't get to see her intake, but the details leaked anyway. The cutting away of her long hair to shoulder length, the issuing of the standard issue beige uniform, the initial psychological evaluation. In her first months, Samantha kept to herself. Inmates who remembered seeing her on the news tried to bait her with questions. "You really cut him up? How much money did you think you'd get?" But she rarely answered. The prison counselor later said she came across as controlled, maybe too controlled. She worked in the laundry detail, folding uniforms and linens for hours at a time. Her only regular visitors were her attorney, Robert Kellerman, and Emily Carter, the friend who had first told her she'd seen Jason with another woman. Emily brought books, mostly crime novels and memoirs, and updates about Samantha's daughter, now living with Jason's parents in Westlake Hills. Through Kellerman, Samantha filed an appeal, arguing that the court had failed to fully consider her history of abuse and the threat she believed she faced that night. But the appellate court upheld the conviction, noting the physical evidence was overwhelmingly inconsistent with a self-defense claim. The city's long memory. In Austin, the Whitmore case never truly faded. Every time a high-profile domestic homicide hit the news, someone would bring it up. It became a reference point in conversations about marriage, money, and power. Talk shows used it to debate whether past abuse justified lethal force. True crime podcasts revisited it in multi-part series, often with titles like The 3 Suitcases or The Penthouse Marriage. Some hosts leaned toward the prosecution's view, pointing to the methodical dismemberment and multiple disposal sites. Others framed Samantha as a tragic figure. Flawed, yes, but backed into a corner by a man with far more resources and influence. Jason's parents rarely spoke publicly about their son's murder. When they did, it was in the context of their granddaughter. They were granted permanent custody and worked to keep her out of the media's reach. One rare interview, given 2 years after the trial, was short but telling. "We lost our son," Jason's mother said. "And in a way, we lost our granddaughter's mother too. There's no winning here. There's just living with what's left." Inside the walls. In prison, Samantha adapted. She earned a certificate in paralegal studies through a correspondence program. She took on a mentorship role in a program for younger inmates, teaching them basic legal research skills and helping them write clemency petitions. Some saw this as image management, a way to make a better case for parole down the line. Others believed it was genuine. Emily Carter said, "She told me once, 'I've already lost the life I had. I might as well try to make the next years count for something.'" But she never spoke publicly about the details of June 12th. Not in interviews, not in letters, not to fellow inmates. The closest she came was telling Emily, "People think they know, but they only know the pieces they've been given." Parole and possibility. With good behavior, Samantha could be eligible for parole after 18 years. That would put her release in 2039, when she'd be 50. Whether she would still have a relationship with her daughter then was uncertain. Legal analysts speculated that if attitudes toward domestic abuse defenses continued to evolve, she might stand a better chance at early release. But the brutal nature of the dismemberment and the fact that her case had been so public would weigh heavily against her. The lingering question. In the years after the trial, one question lingered in Austin's collective mind. Was this a cold-blooded killing by a woman unwilling to lose her privileged life? Or was it the desperate act of someone who had been cornered for too long? Those who believed the former pointed to the calculated disposal, the multiple drop sites, the bleach and garbage bags. Those who believed the latter cited her history, the slap that night, and the threats about taking her daughter. It was a case where two truths could exist at once, that Jason Whitmore had been unfaithful, controlling, and perhaps cruel, and that Samantha Reed had responded in a way that was both irreversible and unforgivable. The story that stays. By 2025, the Whitmore penthouse had been sold to an out-of-state investor. The new owners remodeled, stripping the gun room, replacing the glass wine cellar with a minimalist living space. Still, longtime residents of the building said they sometimes caught themselves glancing at the service elevator, remembering the grainy footage of a woman in the early morning light, struggling to push 3 suitcases into it. And somewhere in Gatesville, Samantha Reed folded another stack of prison uniforms, the years ticking down in a place where time moved both too slowly and too fast. In the end, the Whitmore case didn't leave Austin with a clear moral. It left a story, one of wealth and betrayal, of control and defiance, of a marriage that began in secrecy and ended in the Texas hills, zipped inside 3 pieces of luggage.